thank you all for joining us this evening for a reflection on the tenure of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe as health issues bring his fourth and final term as the leader of Japan to a close. My name is Paul Kincaid. I'm Director of Congressional Outreach here at FMC, the Association of Former Members of Congress. I'd like to welcome all of you to our special discussion. If you've missed our regular programming, I'd invite you to visit our archives at www.usafmc.org/sounds. Check out other programs and subscribe to Virtual Roundtable as a podcast. This is an interactive discussion this evening, so if you have a question at any time, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, fill out your name and your question, and if we choose you, our moderators will call on you to ask your question over audio only for our panel. Again, anytime during the call, just click the Q&A button at the bottom center of your Zoom screen. We're joined by a unique panel of only two this evening, one of the foremost experts on Japan in the United States Congress, and the head of the Tokyo Bureau of one of the most prestigious journalism outlets in America. Congresswoman Diana DeGette is a Democrat who's represented Colorado's 1st congressional district since 1997. She served on the prestigious Energy and Commerce Committee, where she is chair of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee. Perhaps most importantly, of course, she serves as House Democratic co-chair of the Congressional Study Group on Japan, with which she's made multiple trips to Tokyo and met with Prime Minister Abe. Motoko Rich serves as Tokyo Bureau Chief for the New York Times and has been a reporter with the paper of record since 2003, after beginning her career with the Financial Times in London. Ms. Rich grew up in part in Tokyo and has been the bureau chief there for the past 4 years. Thank you both for joining us this evening. We look forward to an interesting discussion about the end of the Abe era, what it means for the Trans-Pacific relationship, and where Japan will go from here. Congresswoman DeGette, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Paul, and it's great being with you. I always enjoy these panels by the former members of Congress. And I'm always happy to talk to somebody on the ground there in Japan who can let us know what's going on. As we have our US elections coming up in just 8 weeks, a little bit less than 8 weeks now, we're all looking at the US campaigns, but in Japan, they've had to us, at least to us observers here in the US, they've had kind of a abrupt turn of events there, and with Prime Minister Abe announcing his resignation due to health reasons just a few weeks ago. So I'm looking forward to hearing what Ms. Rich has to tell us about conditions on the ground there and what's going on. Ms. Rich, maybe you can talk to us. Was this a surprise to the Japanese citizens, and what are people thinking now?
Well, Congresswoman DeGette, just thank you so much for having me here today. So it was a surprise. I mean, there had been some telegraphing of his health problems. He made history, as you noted, as the longest serving prime minister in Japan. And it was literally 4 days, actually, that he had sort of set the record for the longest consecutive number of days in office, because as you know, he had a shorter stints before in office. And one of the remarkable things about Japan is that, you know, he made it almost 8 years. And when you think about that in the American context, that's just a normal 2-term presidency, right? And this is like a historic moment that he almost made it to 8 years. So there's the longevity piece was really interesting there. And then we all thought for a while that his plan was to make it through to the end of September of 2021. With the delay of the Olympics, he obviously wanted to be in office to host the Tokyo Olympics if it does go forward. He, you know, certainly had a term that was set to expire not until next September. But for a few months, he kind of disappeared from the public sphere. There were a lot of rumors about his illness. And then it was kind of really telegraphed in the way that the Japanese sort of the political establishment has this dance with the media, where there were all these leaks about him going to the hospital. He'd been there for all day. He'd returned 2 days later. I mean, this was the kind of thing that under normal circumstances, he certainly would have managed to keep secret if he wanted to. And so the fact, I think, that it was starting to come out was a kind of way of preparing the ground for it. That being said, it was still a surprise. I mean, literally on the morning of the day that he resigned, his chief cabinet secretary, who's now the leading candidate to succeed him, came out in public and said, he's fine, there's nothing wrong with his health, he's planning to stay until next September. And then a few hours later, he announced that he was resigning. And it was a very emotional press conference. So it was clear that it was not, you know, his choice, that he hadn't sort of planned this, or this was some kind of sneaky effort to get out from under low approval ratings. You know, it seemed like something you didn't want to do.
Yeah, of course, he really did have low approval ratings. But as you know, now, since his absence makes the heart grow fonder, I guess. Now that he's announced he's leaving, his approval ratings are going back up again. This is the same. This is the
Crazy.
same. This is the same health condition, though, that caused his resignation the first time he was prime minister in 2007. And I remember those days between 2007 and 2012. We had a whole succession of prime ministers, and we had a change in the ruling party too for a few years until the tsunami and all of that, and then everybody said we need to go back to the LDP and have some stability, and that's what has really led to this extraordinary term for Abe.
And what's sort of interesting about that sort of emotional reaction that the public had to the sort of missteps of the opposition's very short term in office. I mean, this is a country that's basically had one party rule almost since after the war, except for that one stint that you mentioned. And it sort of seems like they will never be forgiven for having, quote, messed up that period. I mean, no question about it. There were a lot of missteps. I'm not sort of putting that in quotes as if to say that it's not true, but it's interesting that it's sort of a different temperament of the polis here, that they're so afraid of that revolving door and so mistrustful of the one time that the party in opposition messed up that they're never going to give them a chance again. And it was almost as if towards the end, Abe's success domestically was based on stability for stability's sake. And a lot of people have talked about that. I mean, this is not original thought from me, but there are, experts who really followed his career in Japanese politics quite closely, who will sort of sum up his term as, his signature achievement was that he managed to stay in office as long as he did. I mean, there are a lot of benefits that accrue to that stability, but that was sort of overwhelmingly his sort of bedrock achievement.
Well, and his party, the LDP, as well as the Komeito party, their ally, I mean, they have a solid leadership in the Diet, and as solid as ever or more. And in fact, what we're hearing is the likely successor, Chief Cabinet Secretary Suga, is sort of the chosen successor, if you will, of Abe.
He has 80% of support. I mean, the parliamentary system, as you know, is different from how we elect a president in the United States. So this part of the process is not particularly democratic, and it's even less democratic than it might normally be, in that, they've had a prime minister leave office in the middle of a term. And so there are different ways in which they could have gone about electing the successor. Right. Shows a kind of middle of the road path. There was one path where they could have thrown it open to the entire membership of the party, which would have included all these, local prefectural members, about 1 million of them. And if they had done so, the sort of word on the street was this other candidate, Shigeru Ishiba, who's much more popular and sort of has a slightly renegade reputation. He's liked more by the general public. He probably would have done better in that system. But the process that they chose was mainly forefronting the members of parliament with some select representatives from the prefectural membership. And that really allowed kind of Abe and the various factions, as you know, in parliament is sort of very factional, to kind of line up behind Suga. But the speed with which it's happened and the kind of uniform, the kind of solidarity with which it's happened is, pretty quick. Prime Minister Abe is not, he hasn't stepped down yet. He's still operating as prime minister. He had a long call with President Trump. He's still sort of making sort of pronouncements about, a few policy items that he still wants to tie up. The idea that the party could coalesce around one candidate so quickly is pretty foreign concept for Americans, for sure. But you talk a little bit about the sort of surprise on your side. Was it just mainly a matter of surprise of timing, or?
Well, I think we had heard sort of across the ocean that there had been some recurrence of these health conditions, but we hadn't heard so much that these conditions. It was actually 13 years ago that he had the ulcerative colitis flare up before. So I was there. I was actually there with the study group. Congressman Bouchon and I were there in February, And I think we were probably the last U.S. delegation to go pretty much anywhere. And when we flew back on the plane, I kind of just felt like all the doors were closing behind us. But we met with the prime minister at that time, and many of these ministers, and we didn't have any sense that there was any imminent change in leadership. So it did seem as some kind of a surprise. But as you point out, there's an election coming up in the fall of 2021 anyway. And so the question is, especially with the coronavirus response in Japan, how was the prime minister handling that? And there's also, as you know, festering issues that continue, a continuing economic decline, difficulties in energy policy, difficulties in that I think that they've had in implementing womenomics, getting more women into the workforce. So there's a lot of looming issues just under the surface, I think, in Japan.
You're absolutely right. And I think it would have been pretty difficult year for him if he'd stayed in office. I mean, certainly to the extent that his approval ratings have gone up, it's the absence makes the heart grow fonder. He's going to be gone anyway, so we might as well give him a pat on the back on the way out. That's sort of the sense that it feels a little bit like that. And also, I'm sure a bit of, quite a bit of sympathy. I mean, he's sick.
Sure.
And I think the nature of the disease is it's quite possible he was perfectly fine when you saw him in February, and then they had this sort of sudden deterioration, and kind of the symptoms of it are very, very disruptive. Like, it's just very difficult to conduct daily business when you're really sick with this particular disease. And
exactly.
So, I think a lot of people feel for him just on a human level. But like you point out, there was a lot of unfinished business, despite the fact that on a kind of public health, certainly on a world comparative basis, Japan has done relatively well. I mean, they haven't eliminated the virus, but by and large, the death rate is very low. The infection rate is, bobbing up and down, but in terms of like the people who've been seriously ill and deaths from COVID has just been significantly lower than anywhere in the West. And even comparing to Asia is not bad. But sort of, he didn't handle, I think he's better as a statesman and sort of projecting a reputation and kind of personal diplomacy in international context. He's actually a little bit poor at it domestically. Like, he had a lot of scandals that really dogged him. A long time, the media were obsessed with them. The public was obsessed with them. His approval ratings dove every time those scandals came out in the air. And then I think with this coronavirus response, a lot of it was just about basically kind of PR mess ups. Like, he sent out all these masks to every household in Japan, but they were a little bit small and they shrunk in the wash. And so everyone thought they were stupid, and some people got them right away and some people didn't get them. And then he did this like YouTube video where he's like sitting in the residence, but it's just very odd. He's sitting on the couch and petting his dog and drinking like a Western style cup of tea and reading a book and staring into the air. And this was supposed to be his like solidarity with the people and staying home. But the way it played was, here's the kind of let them eat cake guy locked up in his looking living room, saying everybody stay home. And so, these are not really policy blunders. They're PR blunders, but they're
PR. Yeah.
Definitely affected his approval rating. And so I think people were very upset about that. And then the economic response is just really tough. People are suffering the world over, right? It's a matter of, but there are people who are out of work. There are people who've lost income. There are people who are struggling to keep their businesses open, and they don't really quite, there have been, equivalent of about $1,000 sent to every Japanese household. But, a lot of people saying that's barely enough to cover what we've lost. And then if they're asked to close their business, there's just so much that's really complicated about the economy. And I think he was certainly going to take the brunt of that. And then the Olympics was a huge Achilles heel. I mean, it was almost kind of a can't win situation, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead with it. There's going to be a lot of critics. And if they don't, there will be a lot of critics. So I think that's probably an incredibly stressful situation.
Well, when we were there in February, we were meeting with the mayor of Tokyo. We were meeting, we saw all the preparations, because at that point, they were still planning to go forward this year.
That's
I mean,
right.
and so to think about just moving that for a year, and then of course now the uncertainty about whether that's even going to be able to happen, I'm sure that is a big stressor in Japan in general.
But as you rightly point out, there are a lot of, COVID aside, long-term structural issues that Japan needs to deal with that Abe had 8 years to potentially address, and then he really didn't. Given your, deep investment in energy, I'm sort of curious what your perspective on that. I mean, it's been now 9 years since the nuclear meltdown, and at least the position of the Abe administration is that they wanted to restart the nuclear power plants. There's obviously
Right.
huge opposition to that publicly, but they haven't solved that problem. It's kind of just been pushed on the back burner. Like, they have all these nuclear power plants that are sitting mothballed, but they're now more dependent on carbon emitting fuel as a result of that, and they haven't really solved that problem. And then on the women front, he made all these promises, glitzy promises, about how he was going to create a society in which women could shine, and he would empower women. And on the international stage, when he was at Davos, he would boast about the labor force participation rate. But he didn't tell everybody that most of those women are working in part-time or contract jobs, and as it happens under COVID, that women have suffered the most in the work. Women in the workforce have suffered disproportionately because they're in jobs that are easy to cut off, or in industries like healthcare, hospitality, retail, and tourism, and they've lost jobs during this period. So a lot of kind of the structural things that he promised or talked about really remain unresolved. And it's not clear, given that his successor is basically his chief cabinet secretary, which is sort of like having your chief of staff take your place. We're all wondering, like, what is the next step? And I wonder how you see it from your perspective.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I mean, all of these domestic policies that you talk about, the energy policy, I've been watching this since 2011, and of course, Japan was really reliant on nuclear power. And then, of course, they announced they were shutting down all the nuclear power plants. They've had to reopen some of them just to keep a level going, but there's still not public support in Japan for nuclear power. And at the same time, Japan really has the ability, in my view, I mean, for one thing, Japan has no natural local energy source. So they have to really think about that. And so if you're importing fossil fuels from other countries, from Australia and the US and wherever, Europe, then it's only going to be a drag on the economy, not to mention environmentally unsound. So one might think that Japan, with its extraordinary ability to develop technology, would be doing much more to develop alternative technology and wind and so on, solar, but there really hasn't been a concerted program to do that. And with the womenomics, I mean, the women I talk to, you live there, so you see them every day. It's true, more women went into the workforce, but they were working part-time, but they were also then taking care of their children, taking care of their parents and their husband's parents, doing all the housework and doing all the cooking and everything else. And that's why so many young Japanese women tell me, and they probably tell you too, that they just don't want to have kids, which only exacerbates the population program. And another issue that we haven't even talked about is the issue of the international situation, because of course China has gotten much more aggressive with COVID, with the flights over the East China Sea, and with trying to consolidate their power in the region. And at least from my view, I think this is one thing that the United States really has not really been engaged with Japan in trying to figure out how to address this.
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that they, at this point, the United States and Japan have different approaches. That the U.S., is in a trade war with China, as the administration is just much more draconian in both its rhetoric and its actions towards China, and Japan is sort of trying to thread this needle. And one can different people will have different perspectives on whether they're successful at it, but I think they're very aware. First of all, geographically, they're close. This is a neighbor with whom they
Right.
have a fraught history. And before COVID, Abe was actually part, and I think Xi Jinping was doing this as well, but they were sort of potentially in recognition a little bit of a U.S. withdrawal from the leadership in the region, kind of turning towards each other, clearly sort of in a very practical way, seeing each other as a kind of hedge. So Abe was in fact the first Japanese prime minister to make a state visit to Beijing in 7 years.
Right.
And then all this sort of, I think it was like 2 years ago, there was this huge kerfuffle that Xi Jinping and Abe met at some international, I can't remember which meeting it was, but it was for the first time. They kind of looked each other in the eye and Xi Jinping smiled. And the Japanese media kind of went nuts for this because the last time they had met, Xi Jinping had looked so, stern and would barely look at the prime minister. And so I think there was this feeling of warmth. And then, as things unfurled, I mean, China is Japan's most important trade partner. So it's very complicated. That being said, and Suga has also been very strong about this, Japan has talked about, particularly post-COVID, about the need for Japanese businesses to reconsider their supply chains, look for other markets, look for other suppliers, so that they're diversified and not so heavily reliant on China. They saw what happened to South Korea when South Korea agreed to host the THAAD missile defense system from the United States. China really punished South Korea economically. So Japan is very aware of how they have to kind of negotiate that balance. That being said, Japan is kind of now the de facto leader, kind of the rules-based order in the Pacific, right?
Right.
Abe is the one who kept TPP together. Abe is the one who came up with this sort of Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific concept that's now kind of everybody has embraced. And even though Japanese SDF can't technically do freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea, they're very supportive of it. They're very clear that, they administer the senkakus and that any attack on the senkakus would be, problematic. And they're very keen to have U.S. assurance that the U.S. security treaty covers the Senkaku Islands. So I think it's an interesting balance that they're trying to figure out. And I think that will be a huge challenge and agenda item for Suga, and trying to figure out how to keep, all of the allies together while also recognizing that, keep your enemies closer kind of thing.
But, and I actually think that's a huge opportunity for the U.S. too, because I agree with you, Japan has always sort of been the bastion of the rule of law and democracy in that region. And people do look to Japan, but part of the key to that has been the US-Japan alliance. And not just economically, but militarily. We have 80 bases there. So one thing that has been, Prime Minister Abe very shrewdly established a relationship with President Trump early on. He was one of the, I think, the first foreign leader to call him. He came here, but at least from my perspective, and full disclosure, I am a Democrat. What happened though, beneath that facade of that personal relationship, there were many things that suffered over the years. TPP, of course, the failure of the U.S. to finalize TPP. A lot of Japanese parliamentarians are still talking to us about that. Issues around South Korea, issues around China, and then just little things like the visas for high-tech workers to be able who study to be able to come here and study and then work. And so I think that it'll be interesting to see if Secretary Suga can try to establish the same type of relationship with President Trump, but really whoever wins that next election, there's a lot of rebuilding I think that needs to be done for the depths of the U.S. relationship, not just playing golf together, and so
right.
I think that's going to be a real issue.
I don't think it's done a huge amount of harm, but I think that because the charge is very good, but generally speaking, Japan's United States' most important allies to have gone this long without ambassador. Right. Obviously, it has interfered with confirmation hearings and such, so it's not simply a matter of being ignored, but it's noticeable. It took a very long time in the State Department for particular key personnel who on the Asia desk to be appointed. So I think there has been, on the one hand, there's been this, as you point out, this sort of above the surface relationship between the top leaders, which I think, in fairness, did buy Japan at least some time, right? The president that came in very strongly, I mean, even on the campaign trail, was talking about all the things that he wanted to do economically with Japan, about cars and tariffs, and demanding that Japan pay more for the privilege of hosting American bases. Right. So the fact that has actually happened in his 4 years in office, some would say is partly because the prime minister very expertly and shrewdly navigated that personal relationship.
Right.
As you point out, critics could say that as a result of that personal relationship, certain things fell by the wayside. I mean, even when Japan hosted the G20, there was a huge argument about the statement and whether or not the US would sort of have this carve out about the environmental part of it. And, French almost threatened to leave. I mean, it was a big deal. Right. And that in some ways one could say, depending on your perspective, you could say Abe held it together, that they were able to produce a statement. On the other hand, you could say that he basically caved to the United States because of his personal relationship. Different people will interpret that same event, but clearly there are consequences to that. And then when we look at Suga-san, there is a question about whether he has the same kind of personal diplomacy charisma or ability. It was clear that Prime Minister Abe and President Trump managed to make a personal connection, and we don't know if that personal connection will still exist. And then, of course, America has an election in November, and we don't know who will be the president. And so again, there will be somebody else for then Prime Minister Suga to make a new relationship.
I will say a couple things. Number one, you can't play defense all the time. So it got them through to a point, but there still were steel tariffs. There's still, there hasn't been an advancement in Japan. I mean, for example, if the U.S. had a better environmental policy, if we had a stronger renewable energy policy, we might have been able to do some of those partnerships. So, and then the last thing I'll say is that I would hope that if President Trump gets reelected, that Suga could have that same relationship. I don't know, but I will say this: that Joe Biden has a long history with Japan, and he's visited Japan a number of times, including right after the tsunami, and he went to the affected areas, and I think that goes a long way with those relationships.
And just interestingly, on a personal level, both of them are people who did not come from political backgrounds, who kind of worked their way up from the regions, have very close relationships with their rural, homelands, and so there might be some kind of personal connection in that way. Who knows? I think the public does not regard Suga-san as a particularly he's certainly not a Koizumi or even an Abe, in his personal charisma. He did have a kind of moment.
He's not even an Ishiba. He's not even an Ishiba. He's just sort of a.
Everyone knows who he is because when, as you know, last year we got a new emperor, and when the name of the era, Reiwa, was unveiled, which is a very important moment in Japan. It's like what we call our years here. He was the one who held up the sign, and that image is everywhere. He's known as Uncle Reiwa, and so people know who he is. It's not as if this person that they've never heard of is going to be their prime minister.
Right. Paul, do you want to take some questions?
We don't have any yet, Congresswoman. Just a reminder,
we'll keep going.
If you do have a question for either Motoko or the Congresswoman, please press the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Fill out your name and your question, and we'll be able to get to that in just a couple of moments. Again, it's the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen.
Great. What kinds of energy conversations have you had when you've been in Japan? I mean, are there projects that you feel like are, on the runway that you're frustrated because they're not getting off, or is it not even to that level yet?
We I think 2 years ago we had sort of an energy themed trip. We went to Fukushima. We looked at the plant. We met with we met with TEPCO. We met with a number of the energy company entities and some academics. And the sense I really got was that there were a lot of ideas, but nobody really had a plan. And certainly when we go there, some of the main messages we hear around energy are, please help us get LNG. That's what we really need. And so I sort of see, I'm from Colorado, so we have a big natural gas development here, and I really see LNG as a transition fuel, better than coal for sure, but not a permanent solution, especially for Japan, who has to import all of its fossil fuel, no matter where they get it from. And now, of course, what they've been doing is using a lot of coal, which not only is it's terrible for the climate issue, but it's also very bad environmentally for the air and so on. So that's not a permanent solution either. I would really, I've been kind of struck by how after the tsunami and the shutdown of the nuclear plants, there just really hasn't been a clear thought of how to get out of this. And I think it's dragging the I think it's dragging the economy down because of the cost. So
do you see an absence of strategic thinking or capability? I mean, one thing that sort of struck me in my reporting on Fukushima was just how much energy and personnel attention is focused on, I mean, like all of corporate Japan, it seems to be participating in the cleanup there. And so you just wonder if like everybody's energy is going towards cleaning up rather than coming up with new ideas. I mean, that might be a very simplistic view of it, but I just wondered if you had any sense of
well,
that.
I mean, I know you've been to Fukushima, but for those who are watching, if you haven't been there, you really can't understand the magnitude of the crisis that was created by that, and the overwhelming obstacles that still face Japan in trying to stabilize that plant and to clean it up. I mean, even now, almost 10 years later, still it is a massive issue. So I don't know if it's because everybody's still focusing on that, or if it's just because of this natural reluctance to shift, to think of some better way. I will tell you, because as Paul said, I've been in Congress. I'm in my 12th term now, and I'm on the Energy and Commerce Committee. So when I first was on the Energy and Commerce Committee, even up until just a few years ago, we still had hearings in that committee where there would actually be people in those hearings who would sit there and say there is no evidence of climate change, who would completely reject all of the studies by all of the climate scientists. Fast forward to now, where of course we had a select committee this Congress that just put out a 500-page report about all of the legislation, much of it bipartisan, that has been introduced to address the climate situation in the U.S., including renewable energy and standards. I have a bill which hits the same electricity standards by 2050 that the Green New Deal does, but does it in a market-based way. And I've actually got electric utilities supporting my bill that says 0% carbon by 2050. And that's how the United States has evolved. And my Republican colleagues on the Energy and Commerce Committee, they now agree that we need to find a solution. And of course, they want to see a market-based solution. But I haven't seen any kind of movement in Japan in the thinking in the almost 10 years since Fukushima. And that's what I'm saying. In the US, we had people who denied this, but now seeing the impacts of climate, people here are beginning to start to think about how to address it. I must say though, I think if the U.S. Is going to have to look at some of its own issues. We withdrew from the Paris Accord, and so we're going to have to really make more of a showing on the world stage to be able to work in partnership with countries like Japan. But Japan has, if you tour the factories in Japan, if you tour the Toyota factory, or I mean, they are at the leading edge of the world in technology, and they could be a key partner in developing some of the renewable energy.
Is there anything, I mean, you make this point about in the political committee, that it was a big part of the kind of getting the energy to come up with a plan was getting people to even acknowledge that climate change was a problem. I mean, hear about climate change denialism generally in Japan, but on the other hand, given how much the country just in the last 2 or 3 years has suffered from, extremes of heat waves and mudslides and flooding, there doesn't seem to be much of a public or civic conversation about climate change.
Interesting.
It may be that I'm not seeing it or I'm not talking to the right people. So I wondered if you encountered that in your visits to Japan or in your talks with parliamentary members.
I think you make a good point. I don't think it's something that's generally discussed, certainly among the cohort that we're talking to, members of the parliament, the business community, academics, people like that. Paul, you say you have 3 questions. Go for it.
We do. We actually have 4, so we'll get these queued up, and I'd like to thank everybody for their patience in the meantime. Our first question comes from Hiromi Murakami of the Japan Institute for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Hiromi, if you want to go ahead and unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Okay, I think I have met when you visited Tokyo in February. Hear me?
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I think I have met you when you visited Tokyo. We had the breakfast meeting discussing about the woman issue. So thank you very much for your very insightful perspective, because you talked about energy issues. So, given, I think we're lost, as you pointed out, that, which direction should it go? Because given that we have lack of resources, we have to rely on so much, oil and LNG and everything, but, and then we have expensive, to build from now on, it's really expensive. So what would you suggest if you were, a energy policy maker in Japan, what would you suggest that we should go?
Well, it's good to see you virtually, Hiromi-san. Let me just say that I think, like the U.S., the U.S. hasn't had much of a plan either. So I don't mean to single Japan out, but like the U.S., Japan has not had a plan other than to just try to get energy. And I think they need to come up with a plan that will try to move towards some kind of energy independence, which would involve renewable energy, solar, wind, hydro. I think that they'll have to do that, and they'll have to have the question about what do they do about fossil fuels as a transition fuel, and what will they be able to do with nuclear. I think those will have to be 2 of the issues.
And our next question comes from Tetsuro Hasano, a Business Advisory Council member of the Congressional Study Group on Japan from Mitsubishi Heavy Industry America. And Tetsuro, if you can, let me make sure I've got Tetsuro here real quick. Yeah, there he is. If you can go ahead and unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, my question is particularly for Ms. Rich, who is very distinguished reporter, distinguished journalist in Japan, I think. So how do you evaluate Japanese media Ms. Rich. For example, Japanese media had reported Mr. Ishiba is popular. But judging from opinions in the internet space, Mr. Ishiba has been unpopular, particularly among young people, it seems to me. Then once Mr. Suga announced his intention to be a candidate, Mr. Suga has become quickly the most popular candidate.
Yes.
And Japanese media seems to be losing credibility, particularly among young people who can gather information without depending on TV or traditional newspapers. How do you evaluate the credibility of Japanese media among ordinary Japanese people?
Thank you so much for that excellent question. To your point about young people, this is a struggle for media internationally. How do we, as a journalist, I've been a journalist for 25 years, and so, seen a lot of transition, and how do we meet young people where they are, and that there are so many multiple sources of information. And I've talked to my peers here in Japan who say, our newspapers are read mostly by old people, and we can't figure out how to reach the young people, and they're not watching TV, and they get their information in other ways. So I think you're absolutely right about that. In terms of the Japanese media, I do think that there is this sort of herd mentality. There's also just a completely different, it seems to me, kind of sense of what their mission is and what their relationship to govern is. In the United States, we talk about this, lofty term, the fourth estate, that it is our job to be kind of a watchdog and to be very independent of government in particular, whether we're working, I'm sure Congresswoman DeGette knows of local journalists who are really dogged watcher of what happens in Colorado. Same, at the national and international level. And in Japan, it feels like there's sort of this more symbiotic relationship, and that journalists are very worried about losing their access to important people in government, and therefore might pull their punches. And so they're more willing to sort of take what they're fed from the people that they're trying to get access to, rather than canvassing actually what's happening people. So their approach to doing their jobs is to stand for hours outside either the homes or the offices of legislators, waiting for them to come out and sort of drop a little, couple of crumbs of information that they might get before the person at the back of the huge scrum. And that's just, and not that that doesn't happen in the United States, but there isn't sort of an infrastructure around that of people that are really talking to the people and trying to find out what's happening out in the world. And so I think that that leads to some of the situations that you observe where, last week everyone was saying Ishiba's the most popular one. And I too was completely shocked when I saw the polling yesterday that said that Suga was supported overwhelmingly by the public polls, because I thought, well, that's just not the narrative that I've heard from Japanese media. So like you, I was taken by surprise by that as well. We don't do our independent polling, so I had no other way of knowing what the public thought other than by what Japanese media was saying. So I agree with you that seems to be a completely out of touch sentiment. That being said, in fairness to the pollsters and the media, it does seem like the public is incredibly fickle. I mean, as we pointed out at the beginning of the conversation, Abe, the day before he resigned, I believe his approval ratings were lower than they've ever been. And then now, a couple of weeks afterwards, he's very highly evaluated. So I think some of these polls are probably not more than a temperature of how people feel in the moment.
And I don't think there's as much polling in Japan as there is in the US either.
Perhaps not done by polling firms. I think it's a lot more, it's done by, so you get like Kyoto polls, NHK polls. And then I think polling in Japan probably suffers from the same problem that polling went through in the United States and maybe still does. It's like who has a landline and answering the phone, and the demographics of who is actually responding to the polling and whether that's actually representative. And I think when we talk about how Japan is so technologically advanced in some realms, but not in others, I think we see that abundantly in media and government as well. And so that might be affecting how public sentiment is even measured. I mean, I rely a lot on social media because Twitter is incredibly popular in Japan. So, we all have to be careful not to view social media as the real world in the United States as well as in Japan. And we all know that we all live in these crazy bubbles. So you don't know if you're actually getting a representative sample. But that being said, I think the way polling is conducted in Japan is no longer truly representative of what people think.
Great. Our next question comes from Tom Byrne, who's CEO of the Korea Society. Tom, if you can go ahead and unmute your microphone, you can ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my question is to both Ms. Rich and also Representative DeGette. And over the past year or so, relations between South Korea and Japan have become strained. If Cabinet Secretary Suga were to become Prime Minister, how would he handle this relationship? Could he move it forward in a constructive manner?
Congresswoman, did you want to take that?
Well, I mean, I will say that I do think that in my many years of coming to Japan, I think that Japanese-South Korea relationships have been strained. I think there's the whole comfort women issue. There's the issue of the shrine. So there's a lot of issues that have festered for many years. I frankly think that from time to time, Prime Minister Abe and some of his ministers have bought into some of that. But I agree, Tom, I agree with you. I think that it has worsened in the last year or two. And it's one thing that the U.S. delegation really tries to help encourage opening those conversations, because South Korea and Japan, they may be natural enemies in a historical way in that region, but now in 2020 it seems like there could be more alliances. So I don't really know. Maybe Ms. Rich, you know how Minister Suga will respond, if it'll be any different than Abe. I don't know.
I don't really know. I mean, it's a great question. We're all wondering about it because Tom, I think, or Mr. Byrne, I would say that strained is probably too kind a term at this point. I mean, the relationships have been quite poor. Obviously, COVID has kind of diverted everyone's attention away, but before the pandemic, things were really quite bad between the two sides. And it's really unfortunate because, as Congresswoman points out, they have obviously historic enmity, but now they should really be almost best friends. I mean, they're close neighbors. They have common challenges in the region with both North Korea and China. They're both strong allies of the United States. They both host American troops. I mean, they have so much in common. They're both democracies. They have similar demographic problems and challenges. I mean, down to suicide rates, mental health problems with youth, women empowerment issues that need to be addressed. I mean, they have so much in common, an aging population, that they could learn from each other. And so the fact that issues are, that they're not cooperating, much less that they're like kind of, down almost as low as they've been in a very long time, is really, I think, for many people on both sides, very distressing. And it's very hard to see on the political level. I mean, when I talk to analysts, people will say that the stones are being thrown from both sides, and that there's a rigidity and a lack of willingness to compromise on both sides. I mean, I think the weight of history and international opinion will definitely always be on the side of South Korea. But for both of them to sort of try to navigate and try to improve relations, it seems like it's an important moment to do that. So to the extent that Minister Suga understands that, I mean, it'll be interesting to see whether he has, a lot of it is about political will. If Japan decides that they really want to move the relationship forward rather than kind of relentlessly focusing on all the ways in which they're aggrieved, that I think is what it's going to take, is one side, whether it is imminently Prime Minister Suga or President Moon Jae-in, somebody's really going to have to try to move. I mean, in some ways, South Korea extended an olive branch almost immediately after Prime Minister Abe announced his resignation. was a statement from South Korea. I think it was one of the first international statements, and it had language in, looking forward to working to his successor and that kind of thing. So I think, there is a political will and an extension of the olive branch from South Korea. So it would be interesting to see what happens.
And I also think that this is an area where a more robust U.S. diplomatic presence in both countries could really help. I think if we had an ambassador in Japan right now, it would at least we could give some support. And in South Korea, say if we had that robust diplomatic presence in both places, we could really help support both countries in their efforts to at least have some reconciliation. I believe that.
And we have one final question from Daniel Chinnan of the East-West Center. Unfortunately, Daniel's on his cell phone, so he's deputized me to ask the question. What do you think about Prime Minister Abe's performance regarding the Okinawa base situation, particularly the relocation of Futenma Marine Corps Air Station to Hinoko?
Well, I'll let
you go. You start. Okay. I'll pile on.
Okay, so I think that in this situation, the Abe administration has been pretty much lockstep with the U.S. administration and the U.S. military, that they have sort of put themselves in the position of saying, we have agreed to this base relocation, we want to support it, and therefore has been very much, it's going ahead, this is the policy that we agreed upon, and that's that. I think that is sort of in sum what the Abe administration's approach has been. And as you probably know, that in Okinawa, this is an incredibly controversial issue, that they elected a governor who opposes the base relocation, who they had a referendum where the public said that they opposed the movement, and the Abe government has basically said, we heard you, we're not changing our opinion at all. And it's interesting because when the last time that the Abe administration has really been strong about, issues or tensions with the United States in Okinawa was when President Obama was president, and he was on his way. There was I believe a G7 conference right before, or a meeting right before his historic visit to Hiroshima, and very unfortunately, it was horrific murder by a former civilian contractor on one of the bases of Okinawa resident. But Prime Minister Abe very publicly excoriated the U.S. administration, talking about, this is unacceptable and you need to do something about this. And then after that, there was never anything quite as bad, but there were a number of incidents of drunk driving incidents that killed someone. There was a kind of suicide murder between a Marine and someone in Okinawa, and the administration was quite quiet about it. So it seems sort of symbolically that the administration had decided that, our position is to be very much, aligned with our ally and the decision that we've made to reallocate the base. And the governor is not an LDP, he was not the LDP candidate. So I think there's a lot of local politics in those decisions. But, in Japan, and certainly in Okinawa, I think there's this sense that the Japanese government doesn't care that much about them or hasn't listened to them. One small thing that I will mention is that there was a huge COVID outbreak during the summer turnover when many Marines came in either infected, and then there was some, an outbreak on Futenma, which is the base that's going to be relocated. And Defense Minister Kono was very strong about, we want you to, act on this, contain this, deal with this right away. And General Schneider, who's head of U.S. Forces Japan, has been very strong on that, on, we are going to, they put the base on lockdown immediately, and they put in all these protocols across all the bases in Japan to show the country of Japan that they're taking that very seriously.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Prime Minister Abe's government has been very supportive of the move of the base. There are a lot of local politics. The governor was against it, but I think one of the mayors was for it, and so there's been a lot of debate in the area, and it has been a challenge for the U.S. too, to try to, like the COVID outbreak was only the latest example of where we are really trying to be good citizens in that area, And so I think I would expect the new administration would continue the Abe administration's position. We're just going to have to figure out how to do it.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We have one final question, possibly an old friend of yours, we think. Nobuku Sasai has a question about political representation of women in Japan. Nobuku, go ahead and unmute your phone, and you can ask the very last question of the evening. Nobuku, go ahead and
yes.
There we go.
Hello,
there
can you hear
goes.
me? That was wonderful.
Yes.
Diana, good to see you.
Hi,
Virtually, though. Yes. And my question is related to the points that Tomoko-san made about unfinished business of the Abe administration in the area of womanomics. And so, yes, our expectation was very high at the beginning because there was the leadership from the top about the promotion of gender equality and economics. So I think that was a very good start. But of course, as you said, it ended with unfinished business, and particularly in a political representation. And for this Prime Minister election, unfortunately, we didn't see any visible female candidates for the Prime Minister. For future, of course, our expectation is still high, but that is the current status. So what do you think hold women back from being more active on political scene in Japan as a long-term observers of Japan? I'd like to hear the view of two of you.
Well, Nobuka-san, you would know better than anybody because you're leading up the whole effort to integrate women into society. So I would suggest to the former members that they have another conversation with you about how we can integrate more women into society. I think that Ms. Rich and I will both agree there are cultural issues, there are economic issues, the whole ethos of the workplace, and the long hours that people work, the after hours events they're expected to attend. All of those are really counterproductive to having women really high up in business. I will say I was disturbed when I was looking at a picture in one of the newspapers of the cabinet, of Abe's cabinet, and there are two women in Abe's cabinet. And I think that one thing that you really have to be able to do is have women throughout the political process who can really push issues that are traditionally considered women's issues, but they're really family issues, child care. Japan has wonderful maternal leave, so that's not as big an issue as what do you do to integrate women back in after they take their leave. But I think that one thing that really needs to happen is to figure out how to get more women involved in politics. I see this in the US Congress, and believe you me, as I say to my Japanese colleagues all the time, it's not like the US is perfect. After working for several hundred years, we still have 25% of women in the US House. We have our first woman of color as our vice presidential nominee on the Democratic side. So it's not like everything's been wonderful, but just getting that critical mass makes some of these issues like parental leave or equal pay or childcare, they make them mainstream issues so that the men and the women are all pushing for that. I think that's something, I think it's going to be an effort for Japan, but I think you will agree with me that if Japan is going to really take its economy up to the next level, it's going to have to have a much more deep integration of women into the workforce.
I agree with all of that, and Sazaya-san, very nice to meet you. I think it's interesting in politics, particularly in the Liberal Democratic Party, that the women who have managed to get elected in the party, and there are very few of them, told me that one of the sort of basic problems is that so many people in politics, particularly in the LDP, are descendants from other politicians. They come from big political families, and that they have strong incumbent relationships and because it's a parliamentary system, they've built up this sort of network of support in their local areas. And quite frankly, for more women to be elected, some of those people are going to have to give up their seats. It's kind of as simple as that. And so it's really hard to sort of push this notion of gender equity when you're basically asking some men to step back. So that's sort of what the frank answer that I've gotten from some LDP members have said. It was sad that, in the 3 days that it took for the LDP to coalesce around Suga, that there were 2 women who raised their hand, Seiko Noda and Tomomi Inada, and neither of them could get the sort of, I think they needed 20 members to support them in order to be eligible to stand for election. They couldn't get that. And so there's that issue. But then on the issue that the Congresswoman has talked about, which is not just about political participation, but also just about the society generally. I mean, the questions of childcare and housework are huge in Japan. It's so disproportionate. If you look at OECD rankings, Japanese men rank the lowest of men in any OECD developed country in terms of their contribution to housework and childcare. And in fact, the 3 candidates, I mean, we all know it's going to be Suga, but Suga, Ishiba, and Kishida participated in a debate yesterday that sometimes maybe you watched, that was hosted by the Women's Department of the LDP. And when each of them were asked about what kind of fathers they were, they all said, well, I was never home. I never saw my children. And when they were asked about their wives, they kind of thanked them profusely for taking care of everything at the home. And Kishida even, made it a mathematical equation. He said, I've been married for 32 years, and I have not been with my wife for a third of that. And so these are the role models. These are the men that want to be Prime Minister of Japan. This is what they're saying. So I think that is a big problem, not just for politicians, but for all women. I mean, I've done lots of stories and reporting on this, and women will say, it's impossible to have full participation in the labor force if you have another full-time job at home. And American women talk about this, European women talk about this, but in Japan, the kind of disproportionate burden, I think the inequality in the household is one of the largest gaps in the world. And so I think that is one of those problems that is really hard to solve, because it seems like it's a private problem, right? It happens inside people's homes. But I think there's a lot of role modeling and leadership. I mean, Ishiba talked about this in the debate. He rattled off some figures saying that, Japanese men do less housework than everybody else and need to do more. And Abe has talked about reforming the brutal work culture so that people can go home. But I think it's a really hard nut to crack when it's such an entrenched cultural issue. But a lot of it does have to do with leadership. And as you said, there was a lot of promise at the beginning of the Abe administration. And I think, in fairness, from the women's perspective, there probably was a lot more that he could have done in terms of role modeling and really setting an example. So, when Koizumi Shinjiro said that he was going to take paternity leave, it was only he was going to work from home for part of it, but it was still such a huge thing that a member of the LDP was taking paternity leave. And so little things like that, you could say that it's all for show and to post on his Instagram feed, but those things tend to add up. And I'm sure the Congresswoman can talk about things like that in the United States, where, we always say you can't be what you can't see. And I think a lot of that role modeling is really important.
Right. We even heard about that paternity leave all the way over here. It was so shocking.
Yeah, it was a big deal.
Paul, I think we've overstayed our welcome.
Absolutely not. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us this evening, and thank you to everybody who attended as well. We really appreciate your being here. And from FMC and from our 2 guests this evening, we wish many of you a happy day tomorrow. And for the rest of you, I hope you had a great one today. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.